Hi, friends. Greg Koukl here for Stand to Reason, and thank you so much for joining me. And I'm especially happy because of the discussion we're going to have the next hour. It is grounded in a book that I read in 2020 and 2021 that was the best book that, and most important, that I read during that time. In fact, I wrote a series of solid ground articles for Stand to Reason that were alerting you to the frightening rise of totalitarianism in our midst that in many ways has gone unnoticed. That series of articles included articles with the titles like Iron Curtain Diary, Freedom Fading, one on CRT called Civil Rights Upside Down, another one called The Evening News, one called The Legend of the Social Justice Jesus. And to be honest with you, it would have been hard for me to write those in any substantive ways without the influence of the book that I was reading, titled Live Not by Lies, a Manual for Christian Dissidents. And I'm fortunate to have the author, Rod Dreher, with me today, who I met privately at recently at a private screening, actually, of a documentary by the same title. We'll get to the details of that. But, Rod, I'm really indebted to you, and thank you for the hard work that you did putting this important book together, and it's really a pleasure to have a chance to talk with you about it today. Thanks.
Well, Greg, thank you for having me on. It is wonderful to be able to continue the testimonies of these brave Christian men and women who lived behind the Iron Curtain under Soviet communism, who did not leave, who stayed behind to resist. And now through the book and this new documentary series out about it on angel.com, we're giving them their voice because their voices have been swept down the memory hole of history, but we're trying to resurrect them so people today can hear from them and learn why their message is so important to the lives we live right here and right now.
You are actually broadcasting from Hungary at the moment, which is that where you live now, Rod?
I do. I'm living, I'm on the top floor of a building in downtown Budapest. And if you'll hear the church bells at some point ring, that's the church bells in Budapest. I moved over here 3 or 4 years ago, in part because I had fallen in love with this part of the world, the former Eastern Europe.
Right.
And they were so unmarked in some ways by the advance of the more decadent culture that we have in the West. And of course, they're part of Europe too, and they've got plenty of problems. But I was just really interested to see how they're managing to put themselves back together after the trauma of 40 years of communism.
Yeah. Well, I've been in Budapest a number of times. The first time, I might have mentioned this to you a couple of weeks ago when we met, was in 1976. And of course, those were part of the dark years. When I returned a couple decades later, I was amazed at how the city had been transformed because all the buildings got cleaned up. They were all sooty and dark, and it was a dismal city. But when I came back, it was one of the most beautiful cities, just glowing there along the river, and most beautiful cities in Europe, I thought. So, but I think the fact that you're in Budapest right now and from that former Iron Curtain country is an appropriate kind of launching point for the content of your book. So I want to start with about the genesis of your book, because it is tied to those people who lived through that and gained a wisdom that many in our culture simply do not have.
That's right. The book started back in 2015, a decade ago. I was living in Louisiana then and got a phone call from a man, a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. And he reached out to me through a mutual friend, and he said, I feel like I have to tell somebody what just happened. I said, okay. He said that his elderly mother, who lived with him and his wife there in their home, had been a political prisoner in communist Czechoslovakia. In the 1950s, she spent 6 years in prison being tortured because, according to the communists, she was a spy for the Vatican. Why was she a spy for the Vatican? Because when they told her to stop going to her Catholic church, she refused. She kept going to worship. So she was in prison. When she got out, she came to America and started a new life. But now that she was very old, coming close to death, she said, son, the things I see happening in America today remind me of what was happening in my home country when communism first came to power. What was she talking about? The specific thing, Greg, that triggered her was the way that a national mob turned on Memory's Pizza. I don't know if you remember that. Back in 10 years ago, a little evangelical-owned pizza parlor in Northwest Indiana. They were asked by a TV reporter, would you serve gay customers? They said, of course. Would you cater a gay wedding? Well, no, we're Christians. That's against our belief. Boom. It went viral. Those people had to shut their business down for days because of all the death threats. That woman, that Czech woman, said that's exactly the sort of thing that happened in her home country when the communists came to power. Well, I got to say, I thought it was a little bit exaggerated then. You know, my mom is old. She watches a lot of cable news and gets really worked up. But the more I would talk to other people who had come to America from the communist bloc, from Russia, from Poland, from Hungary, etc., they all said the same thing. Yes, it's happening. And if you talk to them long enough, they would tell you how angry they were that Americans just didn't take them seriously.
No idea.
And the reason we don't take them seriously is because our idea of totalitarianism is the hard version.
Right.
Stalin, the Gulag, etc. And they're talking about something very different, but no less real.
Yeah. I and one of the articles, Amy, maybe you could look this up for me. I think it's in Freedom Fading. But I don't recall that event that you just described, but there was another one about 5 years ago in Chicago, a business in a neighborhood with people of color, and these were people of color who were running the business. They were huge, one of the most popular restaurants, people around the block and everything, and then Black Lives Matter hit. And then because they're Christians, they refused to put the sign up. And they were, within days, obliterated because of that. It was the exact same thing, but I just can't remember the name. But I was glad to be able to make it public for the same reason you did that, to see this is happening right here in our own country. And that was BLM, that was the motivation for that. It wasn't the gay issue, but those are a couple of hot point issues that are being enforced by this other kind of totalitarianism. And since you kind of introduced the terms, well, let's just jump in there right now, because you make a powerful, unless powerful is not the right word, you make a critical insight, in my view, something I'd not even thought about, between two types of totalitarianism, hard totalitarianism and what you call soft totalitarianism, which is kind of unique to this country as opposed to the Eastern Bloc countries. Tell us about the distinction between those two types of totalitarianism.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned a second ago, the hard version is what we're familiar with. You know, the gulags, secret police coming to knock on your door in the middle of the night, something enforced by the government to force everybody to believe the same thing, because that's what totalitarianism is, a condition, a state of society, a state of being in which everyone is only allowed to believe one thing. Well, the hard version, that's more like George Orwell's 1984. So if we look around in America today or in Western Europe, we don't have that. So why do we call it totalitarianism? Because we have a softer version. That is to say, it doesn't matter to the owners of Memory's Pizza or that Chicago restaurant that the government is not coming in and threatening to seize their business and throw them in jail if they don't obey this political mandate. This is coming from the people. And there are many other softer ways to do this. DEI laws, the way that what schools are doing in many places in America, where they're facilitating the sexual transition of little children. They're filling their heads with trans propaganda and then hiding this from the parents according to the policy of the schools. There's so many things we could name, the whole pronoun thing. But this is a form of totalitarianism too, because there are real consequences to be paid if you don't go along with this sort of thing. That we saw with the pro-Hamas protest at Ivy League schools in Columbia. If you were a Jew who disagreed with that, you had to pay a price. You had to fear for your life. The rabbi at Columbia told Jewish students, stay off of campus. I'll give you a more subtle example, and this is one I think everybody will recognize. I was here in Hungary in 2019, going from interview to interview, talking to people who had suffered under communism. My interpreter was a young Hungarian woman, a Christian, who was about 35 years old. She didn't grow up under communism. And she told me, Rod, I really do struggle talking to my Christian friends about things going on in my life. I'll say to them, my husband and I are arguing lately, or our little boy is not sleeping well. It's really hard living with him right now. And they will cut me off and say, well, you've got to get a divorce. You've got to put your kid in daycare. You need to be happy. You deserve to be happy. And Anna, her name is Anna, she looked at me and said, I tell them, wait a minute, I am happy, but a happy life is not a life that is completely without friction and struggle.
Yeah.
I looked at her and said, Anna, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. And she said, that's it. Where did you get that? It's from chapter 17 of Aldous Huxley's novel, Brave New World. Now, everybody's read 1984 in high school or maybe college, but fewer people have read Brave New World, the other totalitarian novel of the 20th century. That's a totalitarianism, Greg, in which the government doesn't force you to accept everything they give you. It's a totalitarianism based on comfort and pleasure. The government there, the totalitarian society, gives you everything you could possibly want, and they even give you happy pills called Soma, give you all the sex you want, all the entertainment, everything. The cost, though, is your soul. And in that chapter 17, there's one dissident from this society, a man named John the Savage, who was raised on an old Indian reservation outside the city. The only thing he was given to read was the complete works of Shakespeare. So he's brought before the world controller for Europe in chapter 17, who doesn't want to torture him like O'Brien wants to torture Winston Smith in 1984. Right. All he wants to know is, what is wrong with you? Why won't you come accept us? We give you everything. Mustafa Mond, the world controller, calls what they offer Christianity without tears. And John the Savage says, well, I think you could all do with some more tears in this society. And what he goes on to say is to make a case for why suffering is part of what makes us human. It's what teaches us how to love. It's what teaches us what beauty is, and so forth. And finally, Mond looks at him and says, I'm sorry, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. And John says, okay, I am fighting for that. And I'm fighting for God, and I'm fighting for beauty and art and free speech and for sin and for all the things that make us fully human. Mond says to him, you can have it, and he sends him away. That right there is the kind of totalitarianism we're under now. When I talk to high school teachers today, they talk about how young people who have been conditioned by their phones, they can't bear the slightest bit of anxiety.
That's right.
They fall apart.
Right.
So these are the kind of people, these are our sons and daughters, our sisters, our brothers, these can even be ourselves, who will accept anything that the government or people in authority give us, provided they relieve us from the anxiety and suffering of real life.
That is so powerful. It reminds me of a conversation I had with a group of high school students in Des Moines, Iowa. It was actually probably 15 years ago, but it was when the whole tolerance thing was getting really a lot of momentum, and you couldn't disagree with anybody, except for Christians, of course, without being labeled as intolerant. And I wanted these Christian high school students to see this. And so I put a definition of tolerance on the board there, and all views are equally valid. No view is better than any other. Okay, and they were fine with that. And then I wrote this. Jesus is the Messiah, and Jews who reject him are wrong. Well, they came alive at that, these Christian students. And they're saying, oh, one gal said, you can't say that. Why not? That's intolerant. And then she says, how would you like it if somebody told you were wrong? Now think about that. I said, you mean like you're doing right now to me, young lady? And then I said, it doesn't bother me. I'm a grown-up. And this gets to the point you just made. And that is that this whole thing, it's basically the Huxley's Brave New World in play, in some measure at least, infecting our youth, helping them to, teaching them to think that they have a right to be angry just because somebody disagrees with them. And, I read that part in your book about Huxley and the contrast with Orwell. Huxley was 1932. Orwell was 49. Ironically, I learned that Orwell was actually he was a socialist, but he was really fearful of the Soviet collectivism, which he, I guess, pilloried in that novel. But what I hadn't seen, and I'm not sure if I gathered this from your work, or you actually said this, but there's a certain sense when both are happening at the same time in our culture. There is a hard totalitarianism that comes down subtly. I think in the last, especially the last 4 years, it was more aggressive, but cooperating with the soft totalitarianism. And so both of these dangerous things are in play here in our culture, and people just seem to be completely oblivious to that.
Oh, yeah. And, a lot of this is, I think, almost intentional. A few weeks ago, Greg, I got a phone call from a reporter at the Wall Street Journal based in London. He's an American, and he even said he was a Christian. And he wanted to know why more and more Americans on the political right are starting to hate Europe or feel harshly about Europe. And I said, well, there'll always be people who are like that. But I said, I think one reason is we keep getting on social media images like the woman Isabel von Spruce, the pro-life activist in Britain, who was arrested not once, but twice for praying silently in her head on the street near an abortion clinic.
This is in your film.
Yeah, exactly. It's the opening thing from my film. And she's not the only one. Others have been arrested for silent prayer in front of or near abortion clinics. And I said, this is not reported. I told the journal reporter, I said, this has not been reported in the media, but we've seen the films on X, or in other parts of social media. We see what's happening. We see that's hard totalitarianism, putting somebody in jail for their prayers.
Can I jump in?
And we see
let me jump in for a moment, because I want people to be really clear on what you're describing. She is standing there by an abortion clinic. If the film was I don't know if that was a reenactment or that was an actual.
No, that was real. That was real footage.
And the police are asking her what she's doing, what she's saying, and she's not saying anything. And essentially then they ask, what are you thinking? And it turns out she's thinking prayers, and that thinking prayers are what she got arrested for.
That's right. And but I said, this has not been reported by the media in America, but we see it anyway thanks to X. This guy, he said, I've never heard of that. I'm like, it's happening in your own country. But if you only read the mainstream media, like in the UK, The Guardian, The Telegraph, and so on, and listen to the BBC, you're not gonna know this is happening because they don't report it. And this is why I think in Europe right now, where I live, the European Union and also the UK, they're trying so hard to vilify Elon Musk for X, because that's where people can figure out what's really happening that the media don't want to tell them.
I'm thinking right now in our country of the proliferation over the last 10 years of hate crime legislation, and I never liked this. Obviously, I'm not in favor of hate, but it's one thing to punish a person for an action. It's another thing to have an aggravated punishment for a thought that drove the act, or presumably drove the action. And by the way, it's only certain types of hate that are actionable, too. It's not like any hate.
It's fine to hate Christians or heterosexuals or white people. That's virtue. But, well, don't you remember, this is a classic example of the kind of totalitarianism we're talking about. During COVID in 2020, everybody had to stay inside. You couldn't go to church or anything, except if you wanted to go out and protest against racism in the wake of the George Floyd thing. Then medical science said it was fine to go do that. Greg, there's a reason why the book Live Not by Lies sold over 200,000 copies in America, even though it had almost zero mainstream media attention. Because it came out in September of 2020, after months of COVID, after the summer of George Floyd. Ordinary people saw what was happening in their country, and they knew the difference between the official narrative from the government and the media and reality. And this book explained it to them. It sold so many copies by word of mouth, by Christians and others who knew that what was happening was something that we had never seen in our country before. And these people who had lived through hard totalitarianism in the Soviet era, they knew what was going on, and they were trying to warn us.
Yeah, well, I bought a copy, and I devoured it. There was a point where I thought about something in my own experience behind the Iron Curtain in 1976 when we were in Poland. we were told that when we were in this particular hotel in Rovna, Poland, that we would be put on the fourth floor because the fourth floor was bugged. So this was a clandestine enterprise, and we had to be careful of what we said wherever we went, but especially on the fourth floor of the hotel in Rovna. And of course, the juxtaposition of that concern with now people bugging their own homes willfully, And I even talked with the talk of my own church about this. I said, Alexa, or what, is that her name, Alexa?
Yeah, Alexa.
Yeah, it's like everywhere. And then they say, well, you can turn it off. I said, how do you turn it off? You say, turn off Alexa. Then how do you turn it on? You say to Alexa, who's turned off, turn on. Obviously, she's listening the whole time. And this is like, from what I understood from what you said, people from the East who are formerly Soviet bloc countries, emigres to the U.S., they're looking at that, and it mortifies them because of the vulnerability we have to totalitarianism, either soft or hard, with practices like that.
Yeah, and not only that, but things like social media, especially among the young, they put all kinds of information out there. There's a woman, I think she's pretty much the hero of the Live Not By Lies film, Kamila Bendova. She and her late husband Václav are the only Christians in the inner circle of the Czech dissident leadership. And she told me once in her apartment, she said, I just don't understand why so many people in the West, and frankly young people in her country, put so much information out about themselves out there. Don't they understand that this will be used against them someday? Mm-hmm. Well, nobody thinks about that because they're so used to freedom being something natural, something that can never be taken away from us. Mm-hmm. But COVID, that shocked a lot of people.
Yeah.
I remember I was living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana during COVID, and I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian. It's a pretty rigorous form of Christianity. We had people come into our church, young people and young married couples, during COVID, leaving their, I guess you could say, softer, more suburban, mainstream churches. And we said, we're happy to see you here, but what brings you here? Most of them said some version of this whole thing with COVID has scared us to death. It made us realize how fragile everything is, what we take for granted is, and we know we need a deeper, more demanding form of Christianity to teach us how to be more resilient if persecution comes.
Sure. So your church was open during that time, presumably, from what you said.
Yeah, for it was closed for part of it, but Louisiana had better laws, I would say, and so we were able to stay open more than churches in more blue states. But and during this time, I remember telling people, because I'd just been over to Russia and Eastern Europe, the former Eastern Europe, a year earlier, reporting this. I told them something that an old Russian Baptist pastor, Yuri Sipko, told me standing just out off of Red Square after our interview. Early November 2019, the snow's starting to fall. He looked up at me because he was kind of short and said, go back to America and tell the churches you must be prepared to suffer for your faith. Mm-hmm. If you're not prepared to suffer for your faith, you're not going to make it through what's going to come.
Well, I'm just thinking of that period of time, and of course, for a couple of months there, nobody knew what was going on, and so we're just trying to cooperate. And then it just got bizarre, and a lot of bad information coming from the people who are watching out for misinformation, allegedly. And but there's a guy in Southern California, the two guys, I think of John MacArthur, and he decided to stay open. He got all kinds of heat from the state government. Okay, then there's Jack Hibbs at a Calvary Chapel, and Jack Hibbs had like 7,000 people in his church. He's a very popular pastor, and in 1 year it went to 15 because he stayed open. And he said, wrote a letter to the governor, and he knew the risks he was taking, but for some reason they didn't want to make an example out of him. And it strikes me if the Christians, and let me pause for a moment. I understand, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit in a few moments, but I understand there is a concern that Christians have about the appropriate submission to authorities, all right? I think there's a lot of confusion about, but nevertheless, that's where a lot of people were pausing in this. But if all the Christians would have said, no, government, you have overstepped, and we are all going to open our churches, nobody could be hurt, really. But for those who did, many of them had to suffer, and this is the price of not living by lies.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I remember when it first happened. I think it was made perfect sense to shut down for a short time till we figured out what was going on. But this went on much longer than was reasonable. And, you talk about people being willing to suffer like Jack Hibbs and John MacArthur. That's so important because Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the man whose work I named the book after, Live Not by Lies, Solzhenitsyn said in his final letter to his followers in Russia before the Soviets kicked him out, he said, "We don't have political power, that's clear, but that doesn't mean we have to do what they say. If each one of us in our individual lives commits to living by truth, to living not by lies, then we can show the regime that they can't push us around." What did he mean by that? He meant, for example, don't sign something you don't believe. Don't go to meetings where the truth can't be spoken, and so on and so forth. Little sacrifices that mean something if enough people do them. Similarly, Václav Havel, who was the leader of the Czech dissident opposition, a playwright, he wrote an essay in 1977, a book-length essay called The Power of the Powerless. And in it, he told a story, a fable he made up of the greengrocer in a communist city. Let's say in this communist city, everybody, all the shopkeepers have to put a sign in their window saying, "Workers of the world, unite," the Marxist slogan. Nobody believes it, but they all put it in there like we put in Black Lives Matter signs or LGBT pride rainbows just to avoid trouble. What happens, says Havel, if the shop owner takes that down? Well, the secret police come, they arrest him, they take his business from him. He has to go sweep the streets for a living. He really pays a price. But what has he shown by that? He has shown that if you are willing to suffer, if you're willing to pay the price for the truth, then you don't have to live by lies. And if enough people see that act of courage and are inspired by it and take the same path, then the system that depends on lies will collapse. That's what you're talking about. If we in the churches had done that, and I accuse myself too, I didn't have the courage to do that because we didn't really have to in Louisiana. But if I'd been living in a state that had more restrictions, would I have had the courage to go worship anyway? I don't know. I hope so. But this is a choice we're all going to have to make sooner or later.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And for many, a lot sooner than they realized over the last few years. In order to do that, you cannot, as a follower of Christ, as a Christian, be willing to make that sacrifice unless you are convinced of the eternal perspective. And I think of Paul's comment in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, 16 through 18. But this is the momentary light affliction passage that C.S. Lewis titled his famous essay after. Momentary light affliction is producing for us, important verb, an eternal weight of glory, Lewis's title, far beyond all comparison. For we look not at the things that are visible, but the things that are invisible. The things that are visible are perishing, but the things that are invisible are eternal. We have to be convinced that the things that are visible are worth sacrificing for the things that are invisible. And in America, even American Christianity, I think that is really hard to do.
Yeah, we're so comfortable. I remember back in 2017, I went to speak at a conservative evangelical college about my previous book, The Benedict Option.
Right.
And I gave a lecture one night to all the students, they were gathered, about the importance of developing spiritual disciplines. In the Q&A, a young woman stood up in the back, raised her hand and said, "Sir, I don't understand what you mean about spiritual discipline. Why isn't it enough to love Jesus with all our heart as our parents taught us?" I said, well, we all have to do that, but that's the starting point. In order to have that, keep that love of Jesus, to get it down into our bones so that we can know what it means to be a follower of Christ, we have to have disciplines, prayer disciplines, things like that. Right. I could tell she didn't know what I was talking about. When the session was over, a professor at the school came to me and said, what that girl believes is how 99% of the kids here believe. They've come out of a church culture that tells them that Jesus is your best friend. It's very relational. And they come here to the Christian college. They're with kids who are just like them. They think niceness is the same thing as holiness.
Yeah.
And then they go out into the world after graduation, and the first time they're told that what Christians believe is mean and hateful and so forth, they collapse because they don't know what it means to suffer for the faith.
Yeah. You mentioned Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I actually read the Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. I don't speak Russian, so I hope I said it right. But and it was a real eye-opener for me. But as I was talking about your book with people on my team and at churches and on the air, wherever I had an opportunity to share some of these ideas because they were so eye-opening, and you gave us categories to understand what was going on, and a lot of times that's a magnificent thing in itself. I was amazed at how many people gave me a blank stare when I mentioned the name Solzhenitsyn, and they didn't even know who he was. And I was talking I'm sorry, team. I was talking to my team here. I said, I can't believe people. And then
Shots fired.
Some of them are looking at me with blank eyes. Well, I don't know who that guy is either. And no, I don't fault people in that. What it shows is how far we've drifted away from these important concepts, at least in the cultural conversation, because so many other things have taken over. All the TikToks and the podcasts and everything else has absorbed our attention, and we have not been able to, in some cases, or willing to, listen to the important voices.
No, and you know what? This is the fault of your generation and mine and the older generation. I think you and I are probably about the same age. I'm 58. I remember the Cold War.
I want to kiss you next time I see you. I got
please don't.
I got almost 20 years on you. So.
Are you serious? Well,
I'll be
you look marvelous. In any case, we who lived through the Cold War, we remember what the Soviet Union was. Right. We remember that Solzhenitsyn was this towering hero who went through the gulags, who was tortured by the Soviets and kept standing. And they kicked him out, and he ended up winning the Nobel Prize in Literature for the things he wrote. Right. The Cold War, the communism falls, and suddenly it's right down the memory hole. We don't talk about it. And, weirdly enough, living over here in this part of the world, I have seen that the younger generations in the communist countries don't talk about it. It's like their parents didn't want to fill them with these dark memories because they wanted them to be free of it, and to start their new lives. I totally get that. I'm a parent too. But what has happened is it has left them, and our generations have left the young people completely vulnerable to communism, to socialism, to all kinds of totalitarianism because we never talked about it. You can go on Netflix now and find 100 movies about Nazism, very few about communism. And we should have movies about Nazism. We should never repeat that again. But there's a reason why you go to college campuses and you find so many young people who say, oh, I'm a communist, I'm a socialist. Right. They don't know what it is. I tell a story in the book about a young woman. I don't give her name, but I know her family. She comes from a church-going conservative family. She was living in California, 26 years old, I think she was. She told me, I'm a communist. I'm like, really? Why? She said, world peace, brotherhood of man, equality. I said, that's interesting. Well, what about the gulags? The what? She did not know. So this is on us. If we don't tell the young about this, and that's one reason I'm glad that the book has been made into a documentary film. You might not be able to get the young people to read, but you can get them to watch this film and listen to the testimonies of the same people. It's very powerful.
Yeah, it is. The irony is there's a whole lot of people who don't even know what a Nazi is anymore. That's how they're able to use the term in such a cavalier way. 2 years ago, I read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by Shearer. I mean, you want to know what Nazism, you read something like that. I also worked in Thailand in 1982 at a Cambodian refugee camp for 7 months. Those who had survived the Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, the Red Khmer, it stuns me that socialism, really kind of / communism, they're all kind of joined at the hip, is so popular. We have people running for the president of the United States that are loud socialists like Bernie Sanders and others, AOC now, who are kind of gaining ascendancy in that party because they're bereft of leadership, it seems. But they're saying things that people appeal to people, and there isn't a country on the planet who has worked with this that it didn't turn into totalitarian regime, whether it's the Soviet Union, Soviet bloc countries, whether it's Pol Pot, whether it's South Vietnam, whether it's China, whether it's Cuba, no matter where. It's been unbelievably brutal. How is it that they're taken in by this?
Well, because we don't talk about what we, in Hollywood, in the media, we don't talk about what it is. And they think that, well, they meant well, right? Well, I don't know. Talk to the hundreds of millions who were killed by these people in famines, in gulags, just shot. I just read this book, Greg, called Second-Hand Time by a Russian journalist named Svetlana Alexievich. And it's a testimony to, it's a collection of testimonies by ordinary Russians who talked about the fall of the Soviet Union, their experiences. And one of the most incredible things about the book, and these interviews were done in the 1990s and the 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s, so many of these people could talk about how evil communism was, how even family members were arrested for crimes they didn't commit, taken to the gulag and tortured. And yet, they longed for the days of communism. They wanted Stalin back. Why is that? It was so clear. They were desperate for a feeling of meaning, of purpose. They wanted to feel part of something greater. And the lesson I took from that as the author of Live Not by Lies, it's the same lesson that Hannah Arendt, the great German Jewish philosopher, said in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. It came out in 1951. She wanted to understand how Russia and Germany had given themselves over to totalitarianism in either the Nazi version or the communist version. And she said that it comes from people who, first of all, are radically atomized. They don't feel connected to anybody else or to anything else. They've lost faith in institutions. They come to love the idea of transgression for its own sake, of tearing things down just for the fun of tearing them down, not knowing that they're tearing down the pillars of their civilization. On and on she goes, but those are the main ones. That's us. That's where we are. The loneliest generation that it has ever existed in American history are the young people now who are raised online. They're supposed to be the most connected generation because of social media, but in fact, they're radically lonely. It shouldn't surprise us when they open their minds to crazy ideas like communism because they're looking for something to give their lives meaning. I gotta ask, where is the church? Why are we not there? I was out having coffee last week here in Budapest, and there was a 26-year-old girl sitting next to me, a Hungarian girl, and Easter's coming up, and I asked her if she was a churchgoer, and she goes, "Oh no, I'm a Catholic, but I go on Easter and Christmas." I don't like the church because the sermons they never connect with us, with what we're actually dealing with. Now, normally when I hear young people talk about why they didn't go to church, I think, yeah, I've got you figured out. You want the church to be liberal and to validate everything you believe. But the more I talked to this young girl, I felt that she was telling me something I needed to hear, that the pastors, at least in the Catholic Church in Hungary, really aren't connecting with these young people where they live. And she told me, we are so anxious. We feel like the Third World War is coming. We feel like that there is no structure in society, and on and on and on. The church has a message for people like that. But if they only talk to secure middle-class people like me, we're going to miss out. We're not serving these people. And somebody will step in there and give them a false gospel that they will believe.
Well, there's a lot of directions I could go here at this point. Maybe I want to backtrack just for a little bit and talk about soft totalitarianism, a concept that you develop well in your book, and most are not aware of. I have a friend, for example, who is a very effective podcaster. He's doing political podcasts, very conservative, and he's been demonetized 5 times. He had 500,000 subscribers, and bam, he's gone. Now, every time he starts and rebuilds again, but this is an example of what you're talking about, shadow banning and that kind of stuff. But
debanking.
Yes. Wow. I mean, when I think about that, the power banks have to just destroy somebody by saying, we're not going to let you do business with us. Yeah.
And they have the right to do that. They shouldn't, but they do.
Okay, now, but here's another thing that was a new one for me in your book, and you call it surveillance capitalism. And this is another tool of soft totalitarianism. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, we have developed over the last 20, 30 years since the rise of the internet and smartphones, a model of doing business that hoovers up information about us from our online profile. And the people who get this information sell it to businesses so they can learn how to better market things to us. And they're even coming up with things now. It's probably already exists. It was still being developed when I wrote the book about software to put into smart TVs that can read the facial expressions of the people sitting on the couch so they can know at what point they're emotionally engaged with an ad or something like that. This is all so they can better manipulate your brain chemistry and sell you things. Mm-hmm. Well, the problem with this is that information goes somewhere and it's never lost. And they end up knowing, just for the fact of just the information they get trying to sell you things, they know so much about your life. And it's even gone further now. If I were writing the book again today, I would talk about AI. We are moving swiftly into a world that is governed. I mean, I say governed, I don't mean politically, but an economic and social order where AI will know so much more about us. And we're doing this because it makes life easier for us all. It's all about convenience and comfort. But we are surrendering so much information about ourselves for the sake of consumer convenience that, and this information, it can and will, I fear, be used against us. Yeah. But we don't see it as totalitarianism because it's all about the consumer capitalist experience, make things easier. We all have the experience too, Greg, of talking about something, and then the next time we check our smartphone, there's an ad there based on what we said. The smartphone is listening to us. It is. We know this. Like the Alexa. I know this, but do you think for 1 second I don't use my smartphone? No, I've just sort of accustomed myself to this.
Well, it's kind of like having a car. You can't survive without it anymore. And by the way, what you just described is like Huxley's Brave New World. I mean, it's all the consumer stuff, all the things we want and satisfy us. When I was looking at my Amazon, because we purchase everything through Amazon. It's inexpensive. It shows up at your door the next day, at least here in the States, And there are ads about fishing and woodworking and things that I'm interested in, and books. And all of a sudden there's these cute little girls, young ladies in fancy dresses. And I'm thinking, how'd that get there? Well, it's my daughter. My 17-year-old daughter has been checking things out. I don't want people to see that thinking that's what I'm looking at. But that's part of what you're talking about. That's Huxley's approach, or the Brave New World approach. It's amazing that these two books, Brave New World and 1984, written 75 years ago or so, approximately, were so prescient in anticipating the kind of thing we were facing. Of course, Orwell had an example there in the Soviet Union, but Huxley didn't. It's just amazing how, unfortunately, these prophetic visions of the dystopian future are coming together before our eyes, and we are largely blind to it.
Right, and there's an intellectual who is really underappreciated in American life. His name is Philip Rieff, R-I-E-F-F. He was an unbelieving Jew, a secular Jew. He wrote a book in 1966 called The Triumph of the Therapeutic, and it is completely prophetic about the world we live in today. His basic theory was this, that sometime around the beginning of the 20th century, we lost God. And even though he didn't believe in God, he's analyzing society, right? Mm-hmm. And he says that in the past, we believed in a sacred canopy. We believed that there was a transcendent authority that told us how the world was made and what our morality should be and so forth. But we've lost that generally in the 20th century. What we've replaced it with, he calls the therapeutic. By what he meant by that was a strategy by which we keep the anxiety about the meaninglessness of life without God at bay through consumerism, through sex, through sexual revolution, he said,
Distractions.
was... Yeah, just try. You hear the church bells here. I wish I could kick them off.
That's a different distraction, but it's a pleasant one.
Yeah, it's nice, though. A nice distraction. And Reef said that this is what has come to take over our society. We say that morality is all about what makes you feel better, what makes life smoother. And when you go on to now, I mean, he wrote that 50 years ago or so, more than 50 years ago, and he saw what was coming. He said, this is a more profound revolution, the sexual revolution, than even the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 in Russia. And he's been proven right.
I think of a guy like Douglas Murray, who you're definitely aware of, Brett, who has been, I've not read anything he's written, but I've seen his interviews, and sounding the alarm of the coming demise of Western civilization, and we're the ones who are killing ourselves with the foolish things that we're doing here, I want to make it's my.
I'm going to pause. I'm going to mute this so you don't hear the bells.
I was going to ask you how long does that continue, but it is nice to be able to have, that kind of reminder. It's the church, bringing the bells. They're pleasant to hear unless you're having a discussion like we're having, and it's an opportunity every hour. At least during the day, I don't know they ring them at night, but every hour to be reminded of a transcendent reality that makes sense of all of this craziness. I have tons of other questions I wanted to ask you about. Let me do this so we don't jam it into the last few minutes. Tell us about the documentary and how people can see it. Okay, you mentioned angel.com is the main website, and is there a paywall for that, or
yeah, there is. You have to subscribe. You have to become a member of the Angel Guild, but that gives you, I think it's something like $13 a month, but it gives you access to their entire library. They made the recent series about King David,
which is great, by the way. I love it.
Yeah, The Chosen, and any number of other, Sound of Freedom, and other programming. I mean, and but you can. The month of April, there are 4 episodes in this documentary series for the month of April. They're dropping a new one every Tuesday, and it will remain on the platform for a while. I think we're hoping after a few months to take it off the platform and show it in other ways, but. It's very powerful, and it's suitable for your church. It's suitable for your family, but to listen to the stories of these people, and I got to tell you, Greg, I know these stories left and right, up and down.
Sure.
But when I saw the final episode, the last 10 minutes, I sat on my couch and I wept. And I don't cry at sad things usually. I cry when I see something beautiful and the holiness of these people, these humble people. And I tell you what triggered it. Camilla Bendova, I mentioned her earlier. She had told me back in 2019 that, I was asking her about being a mom, raising 6 kids under communism. And knowing that she and her husband could be arrested at any moment. And indeed, her husband spent 4 years as a political prisoner. And I said, how did you form them as Christians? And she said that, well, she read them a lot of Tolkien. And Tolkien was really popular among the dissidents, even the non-Christians. I said, Tolkien, why Tolkien? She said, because we knew that we lived in Mordor. And I realized when she said that, the genius of what she did. These children, little children of hers, they didn't know what communism was. They didn't know what Marxism was, but they could understand what the Fellowship of the Ring was. And they could understand the people who would come to their mom and dad's apartment and talk about what they were going to do, how they were going to plan to resist. They were like the Fellowship of the Ring. And Camilla says in the last 10 minutes of the final episode, she said, there's a scene at the end of The Lord of the Rings where one of the hobbits says, do you think they'll sing songs about us one day? And Camilla said, we said that about ourselves too. and then she drops her head because she's starting to cry. Man, I lost it then. Because we have not sung songs about these people, the things they endured for the sake of the truth, and in the case of the Christians, for the sake of the gospel. We've totally forgotten them. We have to resurrect their memory, not only because it is useful for us in knowing what it means to live for Christ and to suffer for Christ, but also because they deserve it. It should not be the case that their stories are lost to history. And I got to tell you, a lot of these people are dying now. They're very old. Some of the people I interviewed in 2019 are no longer with us. There's also a story there in the last 10 minutes, not only of Camilla, but of a young man named Timo Kriška. He is a young photographer and filmmaker who lives in Slovakia. And he was a toddler when communism ended. He has had a life of prosperity and freedom. He's been able to travel and make his films, things that his parents and grandparents never knew because they had to suffer under communism. Well, his grandfather was a Greek Catholic priest, and the Greek Catholics, they can marry. And the communist government told his grandfather, you have to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy because they control the Orthodox Church, or you can't be a pastor anymore. Well, he wouldn't do it, so he was kicked out of the ministry. Well, Timo wanted to honor his grandfather's memory and sacrifice in some way, so he went around Slovakia talking to elderly Christians who had been to prison for their faith. Many of these people are very poor. They never recovered economically from what happened to them. And he went to see them and to take their picture. He's a portrait photographer, and just to talk to them. And he tells in the book about just having to pull over on the side of the road and lie down and gather his thoughts after one of these meetings, and to realize that all of these Christians who had everything taken from them, they still had a peace that passes all understanding. Whereas he, Timo, though a Christian, was filled with anxiety about status, about can I make my new film? Where do I travel next? But these people who had nothing had everything. And Timo says he realized that he was allowing a kind of totalitarianism to run his life, the totalitarianism of success and comfort and all the things that are normal in our free capitalist society.
A soft totalitarianism of his own. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a powerful, powerful moment, and that's the thing that ends it. And Timo, by the way, he's got a wife and kids. He's studying now to be a pastor himself because he was so moved by their testimonies.
We just have about 3 minutes left, Rod. There was something that was mentioned in the film. I don't remember it in the book so much, but I just might have missed it. How these Christians that were committed to not living by lies actually made common cause with hippies. During that time, and not so much with other Christians. Can you say something about that and the issue of courage here in our final couple minutes?
Sure, yeah. I remember standing in Camilla's apartment in Prague in 2019 and saying, look, you and your husband were committed Christians and political conservatives, but all of your allies, Havel and the others, they were hippies. They didn't have any belief, and they weren't political conservatives. Why were you with them? And Camilla said, Rod, you have to understand that most of the Christians in this country did like everybody else. They kept their head down. They didn't want trouble. My husband and I knew that standing before God, that we could not be silent. We had to stand up. Now, when you're standing against totalitarianism, and you have to have allies, and the thing you have to look for in people is courage, the courage to stand up. These hippies had the courage. They didn't have the faith, but they had the courage. And Camilla went on to explain that she and her husband knew that if they got sent to the gulag, to prison, that these hippies would take care of their children, and the hippies could count on them too, and not the other Christians. What does that say? It tells us too that this is why I ended up becoming friends and allies with Barry Weiss. She started the Free Press. Right. She is a secular Jewish lesbian.
Right.
But she's brave because she quit the New York Times, the pinnacle of American journalism, because she couldn't speak the truth in the office.
Yeah, I actually cite her in some of those articles I mentioned earlier because she's so good and to the point and faithful to the truth. Gosh, we could, goodness gracious, I'm looking at the clock. There's so much more here. Let me just say that the last portion of the book was unbelievable because of all the personal accounts that you talk about of suffering and how some of it was unimaginable for me, even though I was associated with that kind of stuff in my time in, in Cambodia, Thailand, and also in the former Soviet Union, et cetera, behind the Iron Curtain. But the whole book, I'm just saying, folks, please, Live Not by Lies, Rod Dreher, Dreher, and, not and or, and Angel.com, the documentary, because you'll see the powerful presentation there in 4 episodes. It costs you $17 a month or whatever. It's worth it because we are in a very treacherous circumstance right now, and most people don't know it. Rod, thank you so much for your time, spending time in Hungary. I don't know what time it is right there. It's probably in the evening or something like that.
Yeah, 8:15 p.m.
Yeah, well, you're very kind to show up and help me out here and our team in our group and to share with us your whole journey here, talking to these people that experience this and being able to then put it in such a powerful way in your book, Live Not by Lies. Folks, it's not a difficult read. Okay, I'm just saying it's not. And it's very accessible, but it's something that is going to open your eyes to a whole lot of things that we need to be informed on so we as followers of Jesus can live lives of integrity and faithfulness, not living by lies, but living by truth. Rod, thanks again so much, and I hope our paths cross again before too long. We'll see.
Oh, they will. I'm sure of it. God is good, and I'll leave your listeners with one thing. Jesus, a lot of people admire Jesus, but Jesus didn't call admirers. He called disciples. And you can tell the difference between an admirer of Jesus and a disciple when it comes time to suffer.
Oh.
That's the lesson of these people.
What a great note to end on. Rod Dreher, the book is Live Not by Lies. The documentary is Live Not by Lies at angel.com. Thanks for being with us, friends. Go out and give them heaven, all right? Greg Koukl for Stand to Reason. Bye-bye now.